Hello there, and welcome back to this week's episode on Workers' Cooperatives. Remember to share and subscribe. So straight on to it. My friend Econoboy has already covered this topic in his excellent video. This isn't so much a rebuttal as a different take on the same topic from a different perspective. Before we start to talk about the advantages of workers' collectives and cooperatives, we first need to establish what a workers' cooperative actually is. A cooperative is where the workers of said business own and run the business democratically. There are varying ways in how the business is set up and can be run. It's worth noting here that the business is run for profit and features in many social democrat, market socialist and outright socialist proposals on economic transformation. There are two different traditions regarding workers' cooperatives and how they're implemented into the company structure. So first you've got direct democracy, and the second you've got indirect democracy. Often the options are determined by the size of the cooperative and the scale of its operations. Typically, the smaller the size, the more likely it is to be a direct democracy. The larger the cooperative, the more likely it is to be an indirect democracy. Let's start with the smaller versions. You'll likely know these in your locality. It's the local store run by locals for locals. All decisions are made together, usually on a unanimous voting approach that requires all members to be in favour of any particular measure. I read an example of this on The Atlantic of a business in Houston where all 5 members of a business desired uniforms, but one member did not, and so for several years now, that business has no formal uniform policy. There are significant advantages to this approach. Many small businesses and startups require tremendous buy-ins from their workers, and this, coupled with the difficulty of breaking into the market, often causes startups to fail. Worker cooperatives are significantly more successful than the normal startup business for the simple reason that the motivation to succeed is directly in front of each worker. The business doing well works in their interest because they share the profit as part owners. Another significant reason is the positive motivational effect that being in a cooperative has. The workers have a direct, tangible impact on every level of the business. There is no instance of management imposing upon the business because the business is intrinsically linked to the well-being of the workers. It significantly reduces harmful and exploitative business practices, increases positive benefits such as wages, paid time off, and has a more humane and responsive policy towards employees. A good example of this is where a group set up a practice cooperative and had an employee who was consistently late on mornings, as a way of seeing how the people attending the session would deal with something within a less rigid structure. In most businesses, that employee would be fired. In the cooperative, or the example cooperative in this stage, they tried their utmost to find workable and practicable solutions that ensured the employee was on time and productive as opposed to just summarily let go. It gives off the sense that the business cares about the employee, and that investment allows for a far more balanced relationship. Crucially, it often increases innovation because workers know that their suggestions aren't going to bounce off institutional inertia, but are going to be actively heard and considered. This positive motivation takes what would normally be the problem of the CEO and pass it down to every stakeholder. And that means you've got multiple creative solutions flying in where previously you'd only have 1 or 2 angles of inquiry. Do not underestimate the strength of this advantage. It means you've got people with direct experience of the problem, actively working with people from outside the immediate problem to find workable solutions, and that resilience is immense to a small business. It isn't all good news though. As always, there are drawbacks. As with most direct democracies, decision-making can be a slow and arduous process. That same business I mentioned earlier, whereas a CEO would have had an outdoor patio cover approved and installed within months, it's been several years, and only now has that patio cover been approved and paid for. Because any capital investment into the business directly impacts the dividend paid out to the employee, it can make some employees stubborn towards paying for a business need. One of the biggest risks and causes of failure in the cooperative model is the individual investment issue. Now, this isn't an investment in the sense of financial investment, but that because each member is of equal weight, irrespective of their longevity, productivity, or seniority, it is vital that all members are fully behind the model and how it is to be run. This means that each employee has to actively consider and take part in the business democracy, which is not something everyone wants or is capable of doing. Therefore, it is of vital import that any new worker fully buys into the business model before they are given full voting rights. For this reason, many of the direct democracy cooperatives offer longer probation periods than traditional forms of business, so that they can, in essence, vet the employee and see how they work within the system. Burley, an Oregon-based trailer manufacturer, nearly collapsed because they expanded rapidly to meet growing demand, and many of the new workers didn't buy into the democratic underpinnings. Eventually, Burley was sold to a private investor and demutualized. Many employees were laid off, and many of the employee benefits have since been removed. The second main approach of the cooperative enterprise is the hierarchical approach, in that each worker still owns shares in the business, and do remember that it's still worker owned, but the operating decisions are no longer directly voted on by the workers. Instead, the workers elect a board or any level of management layers who make day-to-day decisions on how the business operates, and each year or even period of years, the members gather to discuss the direction of the cooperative. Each worker still gets that dividend and retains that conditional ownership. It's almost a hybrid approach between the traditional top-down model and the direct democracy model that seeks to merge the benefits of both without the drawbacks of either. Many of the traditional models tend to view their workers as cogs in the machine, and it is quite common for workers to talk about how clueless management is when delivering efficiencies that results in corner cutting. I referenced it in an earlier episode in how the generational failure of a company tends to go from OG creator, child who grows the business, and grandchild who breaks the business. What tends to happen between the child and the grandchild is that in the search of profit, the company starts to try and maximize efficiencies rather than produce the best product. This could be something as simple as changing ingredients for cheaper but lower quality products, or something as large as laying off workers and increasing responsibilities without raising wages. One of the solutions to the lack of care shown towards workers was to introduce guaranteed union or worker representation on boards, which does seem to help the problem. However, because the cooperative model is directly owned by the workers and the board are directly answerable to the workers, not shareholders, it makes it significantly more effective at reducing these sorts of harmful behaviours, because the care is still retained whilst the streamlined and effective decision-making process of the hierarchical structure can be put to work towards the cooperative's goals. There are benefits and drawbacks to either model, and any number of variances, but the salient point here is that it builds in a culture of care towards the workers as its primary goal instead of the profit motive. This is why it's so deeply attractive to many left-leaning groups who see it as an ethical way to make money without exploiting workers. Seeing as we're in the middle of a deep global recession as a result of COVID, I thought it best to speak about all models of cooperatives' best and biggest advantage, its resilience. Though the numbers vary, the general consensus from studies conducted over the last 2 decades is that cooperatives are far more likely to survive the startup phase and in economic downturns. This is in large part due to broad but shallow wage cuts as opposed to layoffs. This, in my view, is a huge advantage, because in the most difficult periods it allows the community of workers to draw together to protect one another and the business, rather than promoting a dog-eat-dog world where job losses become the norm. Because of that innovation point I mentioned earlier, it also allows a cooperative to draw on a far wider wellspring of potential ideas over the more traditional business model. And because each worker is also a part owner, the incentive is there to work hard to save the business. An excellent example of this is the Co-op Group, who on the back of the 2008 financial crash and an expansion prior to that, racked up enough debt to cripple and potentially destroy a company. However, the board, working closely with the members, salvaged the company, and they paid out their first dividend in the 2018 financial year, and were in an extremely strong position prior to the COVID recession. I think that showcases just how useful it can be to a company to have their workers buy into the company in a far more concrete way than the traditional model or the more destructive shareholder model, which is entirely based upon quarterly profits. However, a significant disadvantage of the cooperative model is the liquid capital issue. Many cooperatives, particularly early on, struggle at raising funds. This is because as each member is equally a part owner, their credit scores affect the business's ability to raise business loans from banks, and due to the prohibition on outside control, reduces the likelihood of investors due to the lack of large potential return on any money invested, especially when there is no say or control as to where that money will be spent in the business. Because of its difficulty raising funds, it can be a problem trying to grow the business or even just to get it off the ground in businesses that are initially capital intensive, such as microbreweries. Interestingly, worker cooperatives tend to be far more ethical in their approach to business. The Co-op group in Britain was one of the pioneers of the Fair Trade March in retail, and due to workers' cooperatives, often worker-first approaches, it results in a happier and fairer approach. Just the fact that the cooperatives are owned by the workers who work in the business, and often shop there too, means the incentive to pilfer and maximise profit of a customer interest is vastly reduced. I won't say it's non-existent, because on some level it's always there, lurking, but it is much harder to push that aspect forward. There is often far less risk associated with cooperative businesses simply because of that admittedly boring approach of being responsible with members' money. It's why cooperative banks and credit unions are far less likely to go bust whilst maintaining attractive rates. In terms of equality, cooperatives often give greater opportunity to women and other minorities, but, and this is crucial, the cooperative represents the people of the area. If they are sexist, then likely the cooperative will also be sexist. It's a clear demonstration of the fact that removing any structural bias doesn't necessarily guarantee full removal of that bias. Interestingly though, there is nothing preventing women and other minorities from setting up collectives or cooperatives for their own grouping to get around this issue, and indeed, this has happened and been broadly successful. It's worth mentioning that whilst the term worker collective and worker cooperative are often used interchangeably, they are not always the same thing. Workers' collectives never have permanent manager roles and always avoid the hierarchical structure in favour of direct democracy. Worker cooperatives can be an and or either, so there is a bit of crossover, but they are two distinct things. Another interesting point is that some economists characterise cooperatives as a turning on the head of the traditional approach, in that it isn't capital hiring labour to profit, it is labour hiring capital to profit. Some economists have also suggested that the optimum approach for collectives in this situation is to then lay off workers when prices rise, so to maximise the dividend for each worker. But there is no evidence of this happening, which does seem quite strange. I'd suggest it's because it runs antithetical to the values of the cooperative model, in a similar way to effective self-regulation being antithetical to the values of traditional investor-owned businesses. Economically speaking, the evidence is mixed on whether worker cooperatives perform better than traditional firms. Some evidence suggests that there is a small positive in performance, but not in efficiency or growth. Other evidence suggests that there is no positive increase, that cooperatives and traditional firms operate at the same level of performance. Either way, it's a hammer blow to the argument from many capitalists who consider cooperatives to be naive or somehow an ill-advised approach doomed to failure. Many cooperatives counteract the economies of scale issue by forming leagues with other cooperatives where they collectively pool their buying power together to purchase base resources before individually transforming them into goods or services and selling them. It's an innovative approach to a problem that would normally be a significant disadvantage in the face of larger companies. Let's talk about the political side of things. Worker cooperatives nearly always tend to be on the left, simply because they are direct proof that you can work in an ethical and positive environment that isn't dependent upon the threat of firing, and you don't need those CEOs with their giant salaries. Despite it being a pretty evident way of supporting libertarian philosophy, most libertarians tend to avoid setting up these sorts of businesses. Many social democrats, market socialists and socialists have all at one point or another advocated for workers' cooperatives to become the norm in the economy, as opposed to nationalising non-essential business. This seems like a far more equal and productive way of democratising the economy, and crucially, removing the more coercive approach that corporations tend to adopt, such as Nestle or McDonald's with their sterling record on workers' rights. Potentially, full-scale cooperativization can be a double-edged sword in the fact that workers' cooperatives remove the difficulty of companies dictating to the state once they've reached a certain size, such as Amazon, because the company is owned by the workers who are also impacted by legislation, and so theoretically the interests of the company, that is the cooperative, and the public should broadly converge. However, there is a chance and a risk that this is not the case. When the interests of a cooperative and the interests of a nation diverge, which is to win out? Though it isn't a cooperative, the interests of the unions and the interests of a country diverged in the 1970s in Britain over coal mining. This caused political gridlock, it caused energy blackouts, and ultimately, the inability of any party to resolve the situation resulted in Margaret Thatcher, who destroyed much of Britain's social fabric. There is also a potential divergence in the issue that mandatory workers' cooperatives, because of their very nature, act as an almost prohibitive block on entrepreneurs because they start up the business alone, they generate the business idea alone, but are then forced to grant equal weight over the direction of the business to people that work there. Many entrepreneurs consider this unfair as they lose control over an idea they started and came up with. Social Democrats and Socialists take the position that because they cannot grow that idea beyond a one-man band, that they require labour to grow the business, it is only right and fair that people who are giving their time to the business deserve a say in how the business is run. This largely depends upon your ethical perspective, as plenty of entrepreneurs have started cooperatives out of choice because they view it as the best ethical way to implement their ideas. In a world where sustainability is becoming an increasingly urgent issue, workers' collectives may be the best way forward because they allow innovation and profit without the all-encompassing destructive nature of profit above all. To some entrepreneurs, this is quite an attractive pitch. At their heart, cooperatives are inherently personal. Their values, their practices, their operation all depend on the people within. If the workers buy into the idea, they can have great success. If they do not, they will fail. More than any other form of business, cooperatives depend almost utterly on that buy-in, which is its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. To conclude, I would say this. Despite the teething problems in setting up cooperatives, and occasionally the difficulty in maintaining one, cooperatives and collectives are, to my mind, an ethical way in which a business can be set up and run at profit without resorting to exploitation and non-ethical practices. It can help decentralize an economy that in our lifetime is too dependent upon large corporations, slack wage growth, and skyrocketing inequality. It potentially forms the foundation not only of a great equalization, but also the implementation of a more sustainable economy going forward. And that is no small thing. That's what I think. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Remember to share and subscribe. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.